If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button as well as the bell to be notified of future videos. Thank you.
Hello, Internet. Special evening this evening here where I'm sitting. Special guest we have here. Koos has a tendency to say that every single program was the best one ever. Now, this is probably going to be my best one this week. I don't want to say it's going to be better than any other. With me this evening for an in-depth chat, we have 3-1 Battalion legend, Ben Wolff. I might have that surname slightly out, so Ben, you can correct me there if you want to. Now, I've heard a story or two. I've said 3-1 Battalion legend because apparently the music provided at the base came from Ben. I heard a rumor that he went all the way to South Africa, bought vinyl, brought it up there, and party mode was on with the new music. Also, something special. How many of us can speak a native language? I can speak about 2 words of Zulu, maybe a word of Xhosa, but boy, oh boy, have you heard of that San language and the way they speak? Ben will tell us a lot more about that too. So, without further ado, Ben, tell us why you're sitting here. Why do you want to talk to us? Why did you go to 3-1 in particular? And is that the reason that you could speak the language beforehand? Good evening to you and welcome, yes, sir. Thanks for gracing us with your presence.
Koos and Fossie, thanks very, very much for the opportunity and the honor to be able to chat to you guys today. I hope what I can tell you is something worthwhile and it's something that we can put down in history. I'd like to dedicate this chat not to myself, but to the Bushmen, to those soldiers that kept me alive, and to all other comrades in arms that were with us at 3-1 Battalion. I think we were a great bunch of guys. I think it's a bit overrated to say I was a legend. I was just doing my job. But where to start? To start at the beginning. I grew up in the Northern Transvaal, in the Louis-Trichardt area. I went to school in Pietersburg and then finished up my high school years in a little town called Adelaide in the Eastern Cape. When I finished up there, it was a decision time. Was I going to university? What was I going to do? By then, I'd obviously received the call-up papers to do my national service. This was 1975. And so I decided I'd rather let me go and do my national service. And then after that, we'll see what happens. Anyhow, so back in Joburg at that stage was with my brother, and he went to drop me off at the showgrounds in Milner Park. Got on the train, and off I went to Bloemfontein, 1 South African Infantry Battalion, and there I started my basic training. A couple of weeks into basic training, I was informed that I will be going down to Oudtshoorn to do leadership training. No questions asked. So at the end of basic, on the train again down to Oudtshoorn, and we started doing leadership training. During the leadership training phase where we did our leadership training, strangely enough, the Air Force came around looking for pilots. So a couple of us were sifted out because obviously we had the right subjects and the right scores and the right everything. And I thought to myself, when they interviewed me, I said to the guys from the Air Force at that stage, there was a commandant and a major and a sergeant major. I said to them, me joining permanent force? I think again. At that stage, I was only been called up for a year national service. I was one of the last to do 1 year national service. At any rate, so it went on, guys from parachute battalion all over the place. Eventually, after doing my leadership training, I was commissioned, became a candidate officer. And just before we cleared out, around about October of 75, I was called to the office of our our training wing commander, Major Lodge van Rensburg. And he said to about 8 or 9 of us, we'd done mortar training. He said, they're looking for mortar fire controllers and mortar platoon commanders up on the border. Would we be interested? I thought about this and I said, no ways. There's no ways I'm going anywhere near the border anyway. I'm finishing up in a month or 2. At any rate, then came the carrot. He said, the Defence Force has just introduced a new system called short service, where you get a bonus. If you do 18 months, you get a bonus. And if you do an extra year, you get a bigger bonus. And I don't recall what the amounts were, but what I do recall is that if I did 18 months, I could finish up out of the army and buy myself a brand new 3-liter Cortina V6 cash. And I thought, wow, that's going to be the thing to do. Anyhow, so eventually I ended up volunteering. We were taken down to George, put on a civilian aircraft, flown to Pretoria, flown to Joburg, off to Pretoria to DHQ, where we were kitted out once again, taken to Waterkloof Air Force Base and flown up to the border. We landed at Ruakana, strangely enough, not Ondangwa, not Grootfontein, straight to Ruakana. And when we got off there, here we were, I think 8 or 9 of us, leaderless. We didn't know where to go. We didn't know who to report to. And we were milling around there like a bunch of lost sheep. And eventually a non-commissioned officer, I forget his name, a staff sergeant came up to us and says, are you the mortar guys? And we said, yes. And he said, come with me. And they took us into a storeroom. And they said to us, give me all your kit, all your South African kit. And we were kitted out with greens and khakis and funny uniforms. And that night we got onto another aircraft, which was painted white. I'll never forget that, white. And we were flown, I don't know where to, but anyhow, when we landed, it was in the middle of the night. And when the aircraft's ramp opened up and we walked out, I started regretting the fact that I said I'm going to join short service. When I looked around, I saw all these black guys, all these soldiers, some with camos and some with AK-47s and RPG-7s and RPDs and weapons I'd only learned about and maybe seen once or twice in my life. And all these guys milling around and walking around. And I said to myself, well, something's not right here. You know, has this plane come down incorrectly or what's happened? But fortunately, as we got off, a youngster came running up to us and he said, are you the mortar guys? And we said, yes. He said, follow me. And eventually I could gather when I got to the building he took us to. It was the tower at Sela Airport in Angola. And he took us up onto the first floor. And as I walked into an office, there was a guy sitting there with a pair of camouflage trousers, Rhodesian waxy boots, a t-shirt, a gunner beret, long hair, with his legs on the counter, his legs on the desk. And he said to me, "Wie's jy?" And I said to him, "Wie's jy?" At any rate, it turned out he was the infamous or famous, call it what you will, Commandant Delville Linford. And we got our quick welcoming there, and the welcoming wasn't very accommodating, if I can put it like that. We were treated as new ones, as he said, he called us virgins, because we'd never seen battle or anything. But anyhow, we ended up being integrated into Alpha Group. And so started my adventure into Operation Savannah. Alpha Group eventually ended up going up the coastal route. If you go and look at the history of Op Savannah, you'll see that Alpha Group was the crowd that went up the western side. So they weren't involved with battles, infamous battles like Bridge 14 and all those. But we were involved in one battle that I'll never forget, and that was at Nova Redondo. If my memory serves me correct, It was on the 14th of November, 1975, where we were in a massive battle, where I thought I wouldn't see the sunset that day. But anyhow, here I am today, thankful. At any rate, we went through the war, and then it was decided that all the, as I can add, during this time in Op Savannah, as we advanced, we came upon a group of Bushman soldiers, groups which just joined up with us with a number of Portuguese leader group, white Portuguese and mulattoes and black Portuguese guys who were obviously in charge of these. So eventually, me finding out and being the type that I am, being inquisitive, I spoke to the Portuguese, and some of them could speak English, and eventually it came out to me that the Bushman soldiers were known as the Fletchers. I think you've already heard that, the Fletchers, the arrows. And they worked for PIDE, the Portuguese secret police, or DGS, whatever you want to call them. And they were scattered all over Angola, south of the railway line. The railway line, we refer to the railway line running east-west, sort of through the center of Angola. They were deployed in little groups all over there by the security police, and they were used in operations. But anyhow, we just grew and grew and grew and grew and became more and more. And eventually it was decided, when we had to withdraw, to go to a place called Mapupa. It's at the confluence of two rivers. I forget the names of the rivers. It sits in the Y of the two rivers, a place called Mapupa. And when we arrived there, eventually, when all our veggie trucks and Land Rovers and Unimogs and Berlier Tramagal trucks, and you name it, everything that we liberated along the way, within a day or two, Bravo Group arrived. Now, Bravo Group was Commandant Jan Breitenbach at that time, and he had gotten hold of Holden Roberto and the FNLA guys, and they comprised of Bravo Group. And so we were instructed at Mapupa to do training, and we started doing training, waiting for authority to go back to Southwest Africa with these people. And that's where the Crow name came from. In signals that were sent between ourselves, Commandant Delville Linford, the headquarters in Rundu, and further back 101 Task Force in Grootfontein, they didn't refer to the Bushman soldiers as Bushman soldiers or whatever. They started talking about die kraaie. Wat maak ons met die kraaie? Waar gaan die kraaie heen? And that's obviously where the Crow stuck and where the emblem came from eventually. Eventually, authorization was received, and the groups were taken down to Southwest Africa into the Caprivi. By that time, reconnaissance had been done already, and Alpha Camp, the area and place where Alpha Camp was going to be established, had been established. So the crowd from Mapupa moved down there. Then there was another crowd of Bushmen that came from a place called Rivungu, and they started walking with children, women, dogs, chickens, anything that could walk and anything that could move, and all their little worldly possessions that they wanted, because they had been warned that the MPLA was coming down, and they could get hold of them maybe up from Rivungu. Now, guys that were involved there, if I remember correctly, were Okkie Fourie, OJ Fourie, Kibble Deetcliffs, and a couple of other guys. They walked down there, and they eventually walked down and were eventually met up with vehicles from 10 maintenance unit. And strangely enough, my brother was an officer. It was a citizen force unit, and my brother was an officer at 10 maintenance unit, and he was one of the guys that went up to go and meet that crowd and bring them down. At any rate, at Alpha, we carried on with the training. And by then it had dawned on me that these little guys we were working with had fantastic bush skills, things they could do and things they could say. So it became one of my objectives, not just to lead this crowd, but to find out what makes them tick, to get into their psyche and know why do they have all these qualities that they have. And being inquisitive and having read books, etc., there's an age-old argument about skills and qualities and characteristics that you're born with, and skills and qualities and things that you acquire, that you learn in life, you know. And this became a big thing for me, which I sort of studied and followed, and to try and get into the psyche. And that also necessitated that you learn to understand these people, and to learn to understand them, obviously, you've got to get to hear what they say to each other and how they think and why they think like that. So you can operate with them, you can get results out of them, because make no mistake, they were difficult at times. They were difficult, very difficult. But I realized that, and then so started my journey learning to speak they call the language, which is basically one of the Sun languages. You probably heard that at 3-1 Battalion, we had two main groupings of Bushmen, the Baragwanath or water Bushmen. Big chap, darker skin, also speaks a click language. And then we had the smaller yellow guys that everybody knows as a Bushman. Of them, we had two subgroups. And they referred to themselves as the Wiko Kaum, that came more out of central Angola, and the Rivongu Kaum, which came more out of southern Angola. There was also a distinct difference in the dialect, in their language. If I can think of a couple of words quickly. The Wiko Kaum, when they say milk, they say gumiku. And when the Rivongu Kaum say milk, they talk about gombeku. And there's a number of other words that will come as we go along. But anyhow, these are the things I started picking up about these people. And they also kept to themselves the two groups. And they were also, funnily enough, in our company structure, etc., they were also divided into those groups. And they had their hierarchy in the group. You'd find that a troop was a very, very senior person, more senior than the sergeant in the platoon. And the sergeant would listen to this kind of, these are things you had to accept and learn. And if you didn't, you picked up problems with these guys. But all these things I managed to pick up and learn. And obviously it helped a lot when doing operations, when we were working in Bambaland, working in the Eastern Caprivi. And then I spent a lot of my years there working. Initially, I started off in the recce wing at 3-1 Battalion, doing shallow across-border operations, where we did a lot of reconnaissance work, up to, let's say, about 100, 120 kilometers max that we infiltrated. And a lot of that work I did in southwestern Zambia and Barotseland, up and until more or less up to the Matabele Plain. If one looks in southwest Zambia, you'll see there's a natural phenomenon. There's a plain that runs east-west, just south of the Kafui. And up to there, in that area, is where we operated. And obviously, we did a couple of other operations. We did mine-laying operations. We did an ambush once in a while, etc., etc. And then we started going in full strength with seek and destroy missions. And that started after the attack on Kondo Base. Now, Kondo Base was the base where we operated from in the Eastern Caprivi. And Kondo Base was attacked on the 28th of March, 1978. SWAPO launched an attack at 2 o'clock in the morning, and we retaliated. And we started operating north of Kondo Base against the just east of the Kondo River, up in that section, up places called Imushu, Sinchimbela, Shitotwa, Ngwezi Pools. And we started operating in those areas with major successes. Now, what made it interesting for me, the fact that I got to understand these guys, I presume better, I won't say I understood them totally, but better than the normal guy. We had a lot of successes, not just contacts and enemy kills, etc., but tracking down caches, lifting mines, being able to interdict logistical routes with ambushes, with mines, etc. So went very, very well for the number of years that I was involved in those operations. I remember later on that year, in August of 78, SWAPO decided to retaliate for the operation that was done. I think it was at Kasinga. And they attacked Katima Malilo, where we lost 10 troops. Unfortunately, one of those Monakashitus, we call them, those 122s, hit one of the bungalows. We also did a follow-up on that. I'm trying to think of what the operation was called, but there was an Saffron, Operasi Saffron, that's right. We did that up, we did the follow-up there. And in that specific operation, we, even though we had no quarrel and no fight with the Zambian Defence Force, we went into contact with them. And that's where I managed, or where it's the first time that I saw what we know as the Samuel 50, but they were using them, they were Magirus Deutz 5-tonners, looked very much like a Samuel 50. So I say, I'm not saying that Arms Corps says the same, but I think the Samuel 50 might have been a crib of the small Magirus. In any case, and so it happened while operating there that one got very, very intimate, and you got to know your enemy. Just the way I wanted to get the Bushmen to know the Bushmen, you had to get to know your enemy to be able to get successes there. So eventually I managed to sort out, with the help of the INT guys, obviously, and everybody, the orbit of the plan, People's Liberation Army forces fighting in southwestern Zambia. And they had 5 units deployed in what they called the Western Front. They had Field Unit Alpha, Field Unit Bravo, Field Unit Charlie, and Field Unit Delta, which were the 4 different units, each with their own command structure. And then they had, before the years of Hurricane and Typhoon, or maybe Hurricane and Typhoon existed in the Eastern Front, in the Angolan sector, but one of the spin-offs they had in Zambia was Field Unit Morning Star, which was their special forces guys, which were the guys that were doing these hit and runs on Katima and on Kondo and planting mines and doing all these things. And the commander of the Western Front, his nom de guerre was Baby. And he used to drive around in southwestern Zambia in a white Land Rover. And amongst ourselves at 3-1 Battalion, that one white Land Rover became a very, 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 very much wanted piece of war booty. And whenever we got involved in a scrap, we'd look for the Land Rover and we'd look for the Land Rover, but I never had the success to find. I found a lot of other things, other vehicles, Mercedes trucks, 911 4x4 Mercedes trucks that we took out, and a couple of other things. But Charlie Company And the officer commanding Charlie Company at that time was Frans Ginter, known as Gorgor. His company eventually managed to lay their hands on the white Land Rover, and they brought it out that belonged to Baby. Through all this time, obviously my language skills with the Bushmen improved. I was able to speak to them. We used Bushmen on the radios, until one day one of my Bushman sergeants came to me and said, "We must be careful of speaking Bushman on the radio because the enemy is listening." And I said, "But they can't speak Bushman." And then he informed me that a number of Bushmen had been abducted against their will in Angola and forced into service on the other side. And then I started finding out from our people, and I found out that a number of their families had people on the other side. So obviously they could speak the language, and they were used for exactly what we were using our Bushmen for reconnaissance, for tracking, for stealth operations, at which they were very, very good, etc. So that put paid to thinking that after watching the movie, I don't know what it was called, there's an American movie about some of the indigenous Americans speaking, I don't know what language they speak, but they were, what are they known as, the code talkers or something? You know, it was based on that, but obviously it didn't work very well. But anyhow, and so the operations went on, and to be in the bush for 6 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks, and then we'd be back in the unit for 2 weeks. And in those 2 weeks, or 2 or 3 weeks, it was time for R&R and for retraining and all these things. And one of the big passions I had, as you said, was music. I enjoyed good music. I don't play any musical instruments myself, but I had friends at school and all over who enjoyed good music. So what would happen is I'd take all this bush pay that we'd collected onto the Flossie home, and then I'd visit, what did they call them? These record bars or record shops. I don't know what they'd call them in those years. And then you'd go and sit behind a little counter with a set of headphones, and you'd tell the one behind the counter, bring me the latest music from all the different groups that you knew about. And then they'd sort of get an idea of the type of music you enjoy, and they'd say, what about this, and what about this, and what about that? So you'd end up buying a stack of vinyls and taking them back. And because everybody lived in close proximity of everybody, I went to Windhoek once. And by the way, when I was at 3-1 Battalion, I had a Chev Custom 10 4x4 lime green color bakkie, left-hand drive, courtesy of Onjiva. And I managed to bring it out, and I managed to keep it and register it. I'll never forget the registration number, SCA1045, the Rundu number plate. Anyhow, I went down to Windhoek with this thing once on R&R and bought myself the biggest hi-fi system you could get those days, and took it back to the unit so that we could listen to some decent music properly. So every morning when we woke up, time for music, and the whole base would listen with me, whether they liked it or not. It was just one of the things that happened. And eventually a lot of guys were enjoying the music and coming to with their little tape recorders and recording and carrying on. So that's where the music story comes from. Yeah, and so eventually 3-1 Battalion started becoming a, I don't know what one, a unit of influence, or a show unit. I don't know what one would call it, but we started receiving groups of visitors. Group of, what did they call them? They call them basically what one would call an influencer now. People that were in high places that could influence decisions, etc., etc. And they'd come up and they'd visit the unit, stay in the unit, and we do live ammo demos for them, etc., etc. And the photograph I sent you was one of the skills I'd been taught by the Bushman, was to make fire with sticks. And that was just during one of these demos for a visiting group that photo I sent you, where you can see me twisting sticks and getting blisters on my hands. Each time you did that, you'd get blisters, because the more often you did it, obviously you get calluses, then you don't get blisters. But yeah, and so that was basically, what else can I remember? I worked with a bunch of great guys. The officers commanding we had, Commandant Linford, Major Kunapton, very charismatic and otherwise leader, but a very good guy. Commandant Piet Hall, great man. Major Leon Dupasani. Who else were there? Commandant Frans Botha, Major Thijs Buitendag, all the OCs and 2RCs that we had in the unit, a great bunch of guys. Unfortunately, a number of them aren't with us anymore. Age has taken its toll, and fortunately we're still here to tell the tale. Yeah, what else can I say? Eventually I arrived there as a second lieutenant and ended up as a captain, company commander, became the adjutant of the unit eventually, and visited many places, many strange places. So yeah, what else can I tell you guys? My operations in Novemberland and in Angola were not that many, because they were basically in the Savannah days, and then after Savannah we operated in Novemberland and externally, but very shallow externally, up to about 15-20 kilometers. And then we moved over to the Eastern Front, which was the Caprivi, and we started working Zambia, and that's where I spent 77, 78, 79 working those areas. And eventually, I think in about 80, 81, we managed to clear Zambia of planned infiltrations. And by that time, I'd become embedded in the unit. You know, I was Bushman like me, and everybody came to me and could speak to me about this, that, and the next thing. And I ended up getting married in the unit. I met one of the nurses in the hospital, and we eventually got married. And so at the end of 1982, a visitors group arrived from Windhoek, and with the group was General Jannie Geldnys. And as we were welcoming them when they got off the aircraft at our airfield, General Geldnys got off the plane and walked straight to me, and he said, "Wolff, is jy nog hier?" And I said, "Ja, General." And he said, "That's it, but how many courses, promotional courses?" And I said, "Ek het nog geen kursusse gedoen nie, ons is te besig." And then the general said to me, "Well, that's it, jy's nou klaar. Met jou ondervinding, with your experience and your operational experience and what you've been through here, we'd like to send you to the infantry school." So I immediately, it didn't work for me, because having gone into a unit where, I won't say we were gung-ho, but where we were left to use our own initiative when planning operations, where our hair was, as you mentioned, slightly longer than everybody else's there, and where we grew beards when it was necessary to grow beards, and wore ragtag bits of uniform that we could find that wouldn't identify, to go back into that regimental setup of training youngsters didn't appeal to me, unfortunately. So I said, "General, can't I go home?" And he said to me, "Where's home?" And I said, anywhere north of Petersburg. So anyhow, and then one thing in the next, eventually I ended up coming down to go and look for a place to go to. And I was told about a unit called 112 Battalion up at Madimbu on the Limpopo River. I drove up there, and when I got there, they were busy packing up, and I said, what's happening? And they said, no, they're moving down to Sibasa and in Venda, and they're becoming the core of the Venda Defense Force. So eventually I trundled down to Sibasa and met to be the chief of the Defense Force there, which was a colonel from the SADF, Colonel Piet Fora. Asked him if he had a job for me. Told him my history, where I came from, and yeah, eventually ended up in 1983 starting in the seconded to the Venda Defense Force, because Venda at that stage was one of the so-called independent homelands. But anyhow, I had a very, very interesting and a very, very full career at 3-1 Battalion, and I made the most of it. Did a lot of operations, did a lot of dogs. Just excuse the dogs, but I think my son's just got back. But anyhow, so yeah, I don't know, Fossey, if there's anything else you'd like to hear.
Ben, I think you've taken me, when you started speaking, I realized I was finishing matric the year that you flew. I must have been writing one of my exams in that specific period in November, where you flew from Waterkloof to Ruacana, and that very same day out into Angola. I don't know how many people can rightfully say that they basically didn't even touch foot in Southwest Namibia before going straight in. That in itself would have scared the pants off of me and many, many, many others. But it's amazing to me what I've learned, as I've said to you. And one thing that springs to mind is some of the photos that I've seen in the previous 3-1 Battalion are the mines that you guys lifted and caches that you found. How much training did the Fletchers have, or did they have their training in Angola to do this before they came over to you guys? Or were they just naturals at finding these things?
Fossey, yeah. Let me put it this way. I can just add that during all this time, did a lot of courses, did minor tactics at one reconnaissance commando. They sent us instructors. We did, and one of the few units that we got course reports from reconnaissance commando. Not everybody gets them, and I'm very, very proud of that I managed to get a course report from them. Courses that we did, obviously, on foreign weapons, on minor tactics, very minor tactics. Bushmen, a lot of Bushmen did the course, and obviously the skills that we learned there, we carried on to the Bushmen. You ask about lifting caches and mines, etc., etc. Because of their uncanny bushcraft, and because they'd been involved in the war so long, they'd obviously developed the skills to track down and to find these caches. They didn't get involved with them so easily. There were one or two who knew what they were doing. But as a whole, they'd take you to the area where the cache was, and then they'd warn you, mina, that there'd be mines, obviously. And then the training, the guys we had with us and the guys that had the training, we'd start approaching the cache and looking for mines, lifting any booby traps or mines that we would find until we got to the cache, and then lifting the cache. But as I say, they could read the bush to such a way, and we eventually got to know our enemy so well that if you were targeting Field Unit Morning Star, we eventually knew how they would lay their caches and the type of terrain they choose to lay their caches. So when we entered an area, a lot of the Bushmen would immediately come and start saying, mina, be careful of mines. And then I'd ask them why, and they say, this area, that one group that we always fight with, or that we always track, or that we can't find, except for the guy with the funny boots, or the guy that got the funny instep. You know, that's how they'd identify tracks when we track. That group, this is their type of area, and they were busy here because we found those tracks. And an area with a lot of trees, or an area with this, or an area with that, is where they normally. And that uncanny skill of theirs took us to a lot of these caches, and we got lots of equipment that we took out. A lot of equipment that we took out: mines, explosives, weapons, you name it. So it was an acquired. I'd say it was an acquired skill because of all the years that they'd been involved in conflict. And they'd be able to pinpoint and say, this is, they be over there, they be over there, but be careful, be careful. And then not that we didn't, but we did set off a lot of booby traps and mines, especially these POM-Z mines that when you're tracking and you in a hurry and you're chasing spoor and you want to force down a contact, the enemy would plant the POM-Z with a tripwire. Now, I'd say 60–70% of the time they detect it, and they'd stop everybody and they'd say, be careful, there's something up ahead, and they'd go and you'd find the mine and you could, but sometimes, obviously, you know, we'd miss it, and then we'd have a mishap and guys would get injured. I remember one incident. There was a base up. We were doing a follow-up, a base up in Shitotwa, which is basically across the river, the Kwanda River from Gazombo, the Gazombo Boch, what would one call it, that area in Angola. If you look at southeastern Angola, you'd see that area. And we were busy clearing the base, and the tracks were fresh. So I said to the guys, listen, let's not get too involved in the base here. Let's follow these tracks, because the guys obviously heard us coming or saw us coming or something. Let's get on these tracks and get going. And before I could do that, they discovered the area where the enemy had cached all their stuff. And some of my guys went forward too hastily and stood on anti-personnel mines that had been rigged as booby traps and joined to each other. One of my second loots, I think it was my company second in command, Archie de Pree, lost his right leg below the knee, and one of my troops lost a leg because of those mines. And eventually, it was late afternoon and it was getting dark, so Kazovac became a problem. We managed to get that stage a freelon in, but I wasn't prepared to sit in the open because I didn't know where these guys were, and they'd obviously stonk us at night because they knew exactly where we were because we had the casualties. So I decided to remain in cover, and we couldn't bring the freelon in. And then one thing led to the next, and then the pilot said he was scared he was going to get vertigo. So I said, guys, you know, we understand. We don't want you, you know, to throw the helo away and to sort yourselves out. So I think it's better you go back to Mapacha. So they flew back, and unfortunately, we lost Archie that night. Shock, blood loss, not so much, but shock mostly. The troop we managed to pull through, and the next morning, fortunately, there used to be a Belgian pilot who enjoyed Mapacha very much, a guy by the name of Hubs Fush. I don't know if you've heard the name of Hubs. He used to fly Telstar for me, him and Bucky Smith. Those were my two favorite imp pilots that used to fly Telstar. So whenever they heard that Wolff was in the bush, they'd go up and we'd make comms and we'd talk, and old Hubs flew Telstar for me there, and he brought the freelon in, and we took the casualties out. Did a lot of ground air work as well with those pilots. Great bunch of guys. And then obviously all the helo pilots, starting off in the in the early 70s. Oh, who can I think of? I think of a guy by the name of Splitpin McCoy. I don't know if you ever knew him. Alan Elston. Oh, these were a great bunch of pilots. I tell you, we worked with them like Rory Halser, Neil, eventually ended up flying MI-24s, old Billy Port.
Billy, yes, Billy, he still flies.
Yeah, I see that at the shows. I see old Billy still flying. Old Billy, Graham Chisholm, Arthur Walker, all helo pilots that crossed my path, or I crossed paths with, and always helped, always assisted. A great bunch of guys. A really great bunch of guys.
Yeah, those are all SAF legends, all chopper legends.
Those are guys that are imprinted in my mind. Guys that if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't be here today. And guys that I found, the Pongos always said, go and in the order group and talk and say, but then I found you do that in the pub. You go to the SAF pub at Katima when the green light went on, and you get out of all these guys who are at Mapacha, and then you'd start talking and start chatting and saying this, and we do it like this. And they'd say, but we can't because of hot and high, or because of fuel, or because of whatever. And you'd learn exactly what you can and what you can't. And then, of course, another great guy that helped us a lot was Major Paulo Kruger. He used to fly Pumas at that time. Wampola, also a great guy. Clappert Cock. Yeah, great guy. The guys that really they helped us millions. Those SAF guys. We can't complain about them. And Smiley van Sail on the now there were two van Sails. One of them used to fly freelance, and one of them, Smiley, I think used to fly Transwalls, if I'm not mistaken. C-160s at 28 Squadron. No, we had good times, and as I say, there was a lot going on in Zambia at that stage. But yeah, no, that's basically it. That's what else can I tell you? Incidents and things that we remember. It was a great time of my life, time that I really enjoyed. Met a lot of people, made a lot of great friends. And if you see any of the Air Force guys, do give them my regards, especially when Billy, if you see or hear from him again.
What I've got you. Music is also one of my passions. So I've got you there now. So come and tell us a little bit. Think back to a few of those LPs you got in Pretoria, or in Hilba Record Center, or wherever you went and bought them. I've been sitting here racking my brain what that massive one in Pretoria was called, that everybody went to.
Yeah, I don't remember the name, but I know that I was there often when I went on R&R. My music influence at school was very folk rock. The friends that I had used to play guitar, and so the influence that I had there, I think, was Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, Simon and Garfunkel. Who else? There's millions. And Lindis Fawn, if I remember correctly, and then it became Uriah Heep. Yeah, there we go. There we go. That's the stuff. Yeah, correct. Tin Lizzy. And who else was there? Led Zeppelin, obviously. Chris Christopherson. I tell you, I had quite a broad range of music that I listened to eventually, and I'd get all the latest music and I'd play it. And then there were a couple of Rhodesian artists that made songs about the Rhodesian War, that I managed to lay my hands on a couple of their records as well, the music that they made. Also very folk type music. I still keep them. They're some of my prized my prized LPs that I've got. I remember the song Africa. Who did Africa? What were they called? Anyhow, when they come, I took their song, took their LP along, and everybody enjoyed that. Dr. Hook. Oh, I tell you, you ask me all these things, I can hardly remember them all. And I still listen to it. I still listen to it, but now it's much easier because you just hop onto the internet and all these music programs, and you look up something, and then it gives you all the options, and you find all the old music again, and you listen. So yeah, that was the music. So everybody basically that was at 3-1. I think if you speak to them, their music taste is going to be very folk rock type music. Not much of what we used to call the bubblegum type of music.
Yeah, no, well, that's a good thing. You were a missionary there to the folk rock establishment, and no, that's terrific. It's good to know, and I picture you turning that volume, cranking that. What did they do when you were on deployment? Who entertained them then?
I don't know what happened then, but they couldn't wait for me to get back in the base. And when I got back in the base, immediately they'd say, you know, crank it up, put in the vibes. And yeah, a lot of people got upset with us because when we left the pub at 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, everybody would come to what we'd call our little rondavels, kimbos. Everybody would come to my kimbo, and there'd be a bottle of rum or two and a couple of beers, and put on music, and we'd sit there drinking and listening to music till who knows what time in the morning. But yeah, that was the big thing. I wonder what happened to that hi-fi set that I bought, because it was a hybrid set. It still worked with valves, and it had a wonderful sound. And I'm trying to remember. I think it was a PYE was the make, and I got it in Windhoek. And when I left, eventually I handed it down, and I said to the guys, keep this and make music. So I don't know what happened to it eventually.
Did you leave your vinyl there?
No, my vinyls I brought with. I've got them all here.
Yeah, because
I've got all of them here. Now, them I wouldn't leave behind. And I started at one stage having them put on CD. And then eventually I found that you could get the CDs. You don't have to do it. And then eventually I found you can rip them off the net, obviously. So
yeah,
you don't have to go to all that trouble. Yeah, well, what else can I tell you about 3-1 Battalion? I don't know. What did the guys say? What must I tell you?
You must tell me. Well, you skipped so fast through there. So what would be, I reckon people would want to know, you've mentioned the two distinct groups of the Bushmen, and then the subdivisions in the second group. Were the languages similar of the two different groups, or did they not? Were they totally different tribes, so to say? I don't want to use that kind of language, but for interest's sake, I want to know more.
I think the best way I can explain that is that the languages, they understood each other's languages perfectly, but it would be like the Afrikaans spoken in Pretoria and the Afrikaans spoken in the Cape. It's sort of a bit of a dialect difference, but same language, if you know what I say. And I think that happened because the two groups were split from each other, and they only met up because of the war. The two groups met up. And then you get a third grouping as well, known as the Naigum, and that's the Kalahari Bushmen, which has also got, it speaks the same language, but also a slightly different dialect, and they all understand each other.
Okay, I was going to ask about the more southern Bushmen. So
they all understand each other. One of my vices, one of my passions when I was at 3-1 Battalion was hunting. So all the Southwesters that used to come into our unit, I used to try and get hold of and put them in my company, because they normally came out of poor north of Windhoek on big farms. You know, those farms are huge there. So I'd get hold of them and I'd ask them, you know, where are you from? And he'd say he's from Gobabis, for example. What do you guys do in Gobabis? We farm. Have you got Gemsbok and Kudu on your farm? Many, 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 many. And then I'd say to him, okay, when we going? And then he'd arrange, and then I'd get into that little chef bakkie of mine, pack all my kit and all his kit, and off we'd go, and I'd go hunting. And I'd take 2 or 3 bushmen with me. And so it ended up once that I went hunting with the sector chaplain of Sector 20 of Rundu. What was the Dominie's name? I can't remember. But we managed to get permits in Rundu from wildlife to hunt lion in the Kodam. Eventually, we're 203 battalion. When 201 or 31 split, a lot of them went down to 203 in Bushman land, they called it, in the Kodam. But before there was anything there, we managed to get permits to go and hunt lion there. And I took Bushmen with me, and there they met up with the Kalahari Bushmen. There was a lot of them living in that area, which is basically south of the Kavango in the northeastern corner of Southwest Africa, of now Namibia. They met up there, and then I could see and I could understand when they spoke. A couple of words I didn't understand, but my faithful old bushman, I had a bushman who wouldn't leave my side. He became my shadow by the name of Johnny Kangungu. Now, Johnny, as a bushman, I don't know how he got it right, but he ended up working on the mines in, I think he said he worked on Vaal Reefs those years. And he learned to speak Fanagalo on the mines. And I could, one of the languages I also picked up was Fanagalo, obviously. So I speak that language as well. And when we couldn't communicate properly in Bushman, then we'd switch over to Fanagalo. And then I had 2 Bushman sergeants, Morase Molasi and Benjamin Marcolino. Benjamin Marcolino I still see from time to time. He's at Platfontein outside of Kimberley. We still keep contact. There's a photograph I sent you of me sitting in a chair with a whole lot of guys at one of our veteran association get together. Now the guy standing behind me, directly behind me with his hands on my shoulders, that's my Sergeant Benjamin Marcolino, also a fantastic guy in the bush. Right guy to have next to you, especially in contact situations. He didn't have a bloody scared hair on his head. So, and he'd always look for me. My Bushman nickname was Wangech. Now, why I got that name is, as you see, I had a lot of hair and facial hair and everything. And whenever I used to shave, I used to leave a mane of hair around the bottom of my neck here because it was too low to shave. And it looked like a lion's mane. And a lion's mane is called a Wangech. And then I got that nickname. And just as a matter of interest, Frans Gunter had a moustache like a sergeant major, you know, one of those that come up like this. And his nickname was Kalu, and a Kalu is a warthog. So he got the nickname of warthog. And anyhow, they'd give everybody nicknames. And one of the most enjoyable nicknames that I had a chappie Viljoen in the platoon, a second lieutenant national serviceman. And he had a funny way of walking, of bouncing when he walked. And the bushman gave him the name of Kavahumbe because of the Kavahumbe. When he walked, he bounced. So they had very descriptive names. And another thing they could do fantastically was imitate people. If you had a training session of something, I had a sergeant in the company, Bester, and we were doing hand grenade training. and we'd built a sort of an open square out of sandbags, nice and high, and then they'd stand in there and toss hand grenades and carry on. And there was a bit of a mishap. I don't know what happened, but fortunately it didn't turn into an accident and nobody was injured. And then we had this young little Bushman troop who just come through from what we used to call the cadets, the youngsters. B Company Platoon 3, if I remember. But he eventually got the nickname of Sergeant Bester because he could reenact that whole scene of what happened there. And this Sergeant Bester going mad and screaming and shouting and jumping up and down and swearing at the troop. And he'd shout and swear, and he'd get some of the swear words right, this Bushman, not all of them, but he'd go through that whole. And whenever we were resting during an op or something, they'd always come up and keep themselves entertained with this. Then Sergeant Bester would come up. And the first thing, when he grabs his hat and throws it on the ground and stamps on it, then he starts with reenacting this whole bloody hand grenade scene. So they were very, very good at reenacting. We had a troop in the recce wing, Fernando Kakoto, and he could imitate Delville Linford to a T. All his mannerisms, the way he walked, the way he'd walk, Delville Linford would always walk in the unit and he'd pick his hand up and he'd look around the Bushman lines and see, you know, what's happening and where's everybody. Now, Fernando Kakoto used to do that as well. So they're very, very good imitators, imitating people. And when you drill on the parade ground as well, if you get a guy that was a very good drill sergeant, then they'd imitate him as well, drilling the people and all the little mannerisms. A lot of NCOs, when they drill people, their arms make funny movements and they make funny sounds and their heads go all funny, and they'd imitate all this. So they'd keep you entertained for bloody hours on end. But a great bunch of soldiers, great bunch of guys to work with. I think my personal opinion is that in retrospect, and this is what I say, that the fact at the time it was necessary, the fact that we grouped them together, probably 1,500 fighting men with their families, we ended up with 5,000-6,000 people at Amiga, and we had to feed them all. The fact that we grouped them together, we gave their natural lifestyle, their natural way of doing things and living, and that simple way of life that they had. We encroached on that and we damaged it. And they got involved with all the social evils that come with groupings and with money, you know, alcohol and diseases that they never had before they started getting. And unfortunately, we see this as well now in Platfontein, in Kimberley, when they moved them down there. And they were basically taken down there and discarded. You know, nothing was done, even though they did such sterling work. But the same as 3-2 Battalion, unfortunately, they were taken to Pomfret. And then you probably know the story there, that all the services were eventually stopped to Pomfret. Water became a problem. And I tell you, it is the powers that be at the moment weren't very, very fond of them because of the sterling work they were doing. Another interesting bit of history that I have is that at one stage I assisted with the training of UNITA troops at the old Hippo base. It was where Fort Doppies is, but just further south of Fort Doppies, where Special Forces 1 Recce were. Their base there burned down eventually. It was known as Hippo. We were doing training there, and from there I went up to a place called Safuma, did training there with UNITA, and eventually when I finished up, Dr. Savimbi gave me a pistol. He knew I was fond of firearms as well. I'm a bit of a firearm fanatic as well. I collect them. He gave me a pistol, a Colt 1911 45. And you could see that this thing had worked. And eventually I brought it down and I managed to get it licensed and everything. And I did some research on it. And the serial number on it is C, Charlie, 31322. And I went and I Googled and I checked all this out. And eventually I managed to find out that around about 1917, a shipment of 20,000 Colt 1911s was sent to the Tsar in Russia. They ordered them or they were given to them. I don't quite know what happened there, but they ended up in Russia. And obviously that pistol from Russia ended up in Angola. And it ended up in Unita's hands and it ended up in my hands. And I've still got it at this stage. So I'm very, very proud of that one. And yeah, as I say, we did a lot of training with the one recce guys, and had the privilege of being at Fort Doppies quite a lot, doing training there with the Bushmen and with those guys. Met a lot of the old manna there at Fort Doppies, Koos Merkraft and Dewald de Beer. I don't know if you know any of them.
Dewald de Beer was one of our instructors on land survival course.
On survival, yeah.
Yeah, so I think that was the first time I saw a recce in real life.
Yeah, what else do I remember? I remember we had a lot of Portuguese in the unit that came out with us from Angola. There was a little Portuguese community we had, families. Who do I recall? I recall Kovusha and his wife and his daughter Marinella. He was a staff sergeant in the workshop. He eventually ended up at Northern Transvaal Command in the workshops there. There was Padua. He was from the secret police. I don't know where he ended up. We had an old lady, to call her Mama Nova Redondo, because we found her hiding away in her house in Nova Redondo. Old lady. We brought her with. And she ended up marrying an old man that we brought with her, Rodriguez. And they eventually moved to a place called Bagani. You know Bagani on the Kavango River, the border between the Kavango and the Caprivi. There were gardens there, but they planted veggies and everything. So first Captain Pinky could see her, and then Commandant Cas Badenhorst ran the place there. They moved there. We had some great mechanics, Antonio Letão and his wife. They eventually, I think they're in Rundu at the moment. Who else do I remember? Fernando, old Corporal Fernando. He was a driver. He used to drive to Rundu with our convoys to collect the rations and everything. Now, we specifically chose him because he couldn't speak a word of English. So he got to Rundu, and when he got to the stores, they'd load, and then he'd look, and he'd shake his head, and he'd point to more stuff in the store. Because they couldn't argue with him, because he couldn't speak English, they just load. So when he came back, he had a lot of stuff. And then obviously there were a couple of incidents and things that happened in the early days. The unit didn't have many vehicles. We didn't have a lot of equipment. So we'd sit in the pub and we'd have planning sessions, and a couple of us would go down to Grootfontein, 101 task force, and we'd sneak around there at night. And if there was a Unimog parked unattended, first guy in the Unimog, off he goes. If there's a Magirus Deutsch parked unattended, you probably heard those stories as well. And so we'd get 3 or 4 vehicles and take them to the unit. And when they got into the unit, we'd change their R numbers, paint a crow on them, and we'd go and put them in the transport park. And so we slowly managed to gather a couple of vehicles. We still had 1 or 2 of the old Portuguese vegetable Mercedes-Benz trucks in the transport park as well. And at one stage, we had a lot of these little orange Suzuki SJ410 Jeeps, probably about 6 or 7 of them in the unit. But they just ended up drifting. You know, one guy claimed one and he went home with it, and then eventually there were none left. All stuff that came out from Op Savannah those years. Yeah, what other interesting incidents can I tell you about? Oh, just that these bushmen are such uncanny guys in the bush. You know, you track tracks where I would have given up long ago. The bushmen say, "No, let's go." And you track them for 3-4 days, and eventually you'd force a contact with them. And it's unbelievable. Now these guys, when they got on a spoor, they're like bloodhounds. They just go. They just go and until you found something. And then, oh yeah, another interesting thing that happened when you were operating and you were in the bush. If you told them they must go on a security patrol, in other words, they must walk out 3 or 4 kilometers from where you based, where your little temporary base is, and go and do a 360 around the temporary base and see if they can find anything. It didn't work. They'd say, no, why must they go and do it? It's wasting their time, etc., etc., etc. But if you said to them, go and find jam. Now, jam is honey. Then there'd be nobody left in the temporary base. So eventually we cottoned on that if you wanted a good security patrol done in all directions to see what's happening in the bush, you tell them to go and find honey. And they're gone. And if there is something, they come running back and they say, in this direction, we found something. And there's tracks, there's whatever. And then you go and follow up. Another interesting, in about late 77, we were tasked to go from Alpha to Sefuma. I don't know if you know where Sefuma is. It's the corner of the Kondo River and the Western Caprivi. Up in that top corner there. I don't know. You probably know where Emmelman Airfield is in the Caprivi, just north of Doppies. Well, it's still further north. It's still further up. So what we do is we were tasked to go up north to a place called Luyana, where the Luyana and the Biengi rivers meet and then run into the Kondo River. There was an old safari camp, the Portuguese. That used to be a safari area for the Portuguese where they used to hunt, and was very well known for sable antelope, those Angolan sables, those huge things. And we used to do a lot of trophy hunting. Now, that area was relatively quiet, but we were tasked to go there and go and check and make sure things were quiet. So we'd get into the Unimogs and we'd drive to Sefuma, we'd overnight there, and then we'd infiltrate and start driving up north, basically parallel to the Kondo River to get up to Luyana. And while we were on our way one day, the first thing that I saw a herd of buffalo that took about 10 minutes to cross our path in front of us. It looked like a sea of dust and, you know, these bodies. It was unbelievable. There must have been 1,000, 2,000 buffalo. Many, many, many buffalo, because I remember standing, the Unimogs were left-hand drive, and I remember standing in the front, right-hand side, straight up, holding onto the windscreen and looking at all this and saying, geez, Africa is actually a wonderful country. And all these animals running past. But anyhow, late that afternoon, I heard this agitated clicking amongst the bushmen talking to each other. And then you know something's not like it. So I stopped the whole issue and I called them closer and I said, what's happening? What's going on? Are we going to be attacked tonight? What did you find, Spoor? What's wrong? So one bushman came forward. I don't recall his name. And he said to me, we found a track further back, a single track. And that track that we found is my brother's wife's sister's cousin's aunt's father's son. And I looked at him and I said, what? You find a track and you tell me who it is? He says, yeah, no, he knows the track. So they could read a track on the ground like we read a name in a book, which is unbelievable. You know, I tell this to people that don't want to believe me, but that's how it works. So I said, so what's the story? He said, no, he's one of the guys that remained behind in Angola. They didn't come out, and he lives in this area, in that southeastern part of Angola. So I said, what's wrong? What's the story? So I said, no, they just want to go and look for him quickly and see if they can find him. So they're gone. An hour later, they come back. They got the little, what I call a wild bushman, still in a loincloth with his bow and arrow and his axe. And they bring him and they say, this is the guy. We found him, but he needs help. I said, what do you mean he needs help? He says, his father and him were hunting. His father managed to lay his hands on an old British tower musket, his old voorleier. And there's a spring with a lot of sulfur somewhere in the area. They take sulfur and they take charcoal from the fire and they mix it and they make gunpowder. Then they cut off the legs of a potjie, you know, a 3-been potjie. They cut off the leg to use as a projectile. They take a piece of wire. They take a piece of wire about 1 centimeter long and they knock it flat and bend it into a U shape. Put a match head, clamp a match head in that U and put it over the firing nipple on that voorleier. So that when the hammer hits that, you've taken a match and hit it with a hammer before. It goes off. And then they take the leg of the pot that they cut to use as a projectile. They put it in the palm of their hand and they throw this mixture of powder that they made until it covers the projectile. That's enough powder. They then throw the powder down the barrel. Take mopani leaves, mopani tree leaves, and tamp the powder with mopani tree leaves because they don't have any other material. Then they hold, they explained all this to me. They hold the voorleier behind his back. And he takes that projectile and he turns it above his head 3 or 4 times and drops it down the barrel. Then I asked him, why do they do that? He says, no, if they do that, then they've taken all the spin and running around out of that projectile. It's going to travel straight. I said, okay, all right, if you say so. And then they tamp it with mopani leaves again. And then they gave me the whole reenactment of how you use this thing, how you cock it and how you aim with it, you know, and shooting it. But anyhow, so they said to me they had this thing and they were walking around and they found a rhino cow and a calf. So the bushman, the older bushman said to the younger one, if we shoot that rhino and we get all of that horn, for a year, we don't have to come running around the bush looking for food. Because if we can get this thing to Rundu or to Katima or somewhere, the guys that are going to buy it, we're going to get money and we're going to buy Western, we're going to buy milli meal and salt and you name it. So they decided they're going to give it a bash. And they stalked this rhino cow till they were about 20 meters away. The old man down on his haunches, cocked this thing and let fly. But obviously, this home-built powder and the projectile and everything weren't up to scratch. So it just annoyed that cow and she came. And she came with great speed. And they split and ran. And the cow eventually decided he's going to chase the older bushman, the one that fired the shot. And he ran into a hak and steek, you know, a hak and steek bos. So much so that he couldn't get out there. He couldn't extricate himself. He was, I tell you. So the little bushman said, please come and help us get this oak out of, we need, you know, some medics as well because he's badly torn up and everything. So eventually we get into the Unimog and we drive about 3-4 kilometers and we get to this bush. Now, when I got there and I saw this oak, he's stuck in that hak and steek. He looks like a swastika. He can't move, I tell you. The eyelids are hooked, and his head was hooked, and his arms, and his legs, and his stomach. So eventually the bushies got stuck in there with their little axes, and they chopped, and we took him out, and I gave him to the medics, and they mercurochrome and methylate and patched him up and everything, and sorted him out. and got him going. And they were very thankful. We gave them a rat pack of 2, and they said, thanks. And then this older bushman, I asked him to show me what happened. Now, what I explained now, what happened about the shooting, he took me back on his tracks. And he said, when we got here, we saw them, and this is where we decided. And you could see his tracks, and you could see where he knelt down to shoot. And then you could see those tracks where you just see those spin marks in the sand when they gapped it. Yeah, when they gapped it. And that obviously that little bushman, the younger one, that's when he came running past where we intersected his track and where the guys saw it, and they said that who it was and what it, and that was on our way to Luyana that we cut the bush there with his tower musket. Yeah, those bushmen that stayed in that part of Angola eventually moved down to places called Bwabata and Dam 15, etc., etc. And a lot of them worked for the security police. You know, they did shallow walking around in Angola for the security police and identifying places, etc., etc. That I also found out later on. And then speaking about, I told you that the enemy also sort of forced bushmen to work for them. We did an operation once to the west of Rundu, a place called Mpunguflay, etc., etc. And 2 or 3 of my bushmen AWOL. And they went up to a place called Nkurumkuru. And eventually we followed them, and I found them, and I was deciding whether I'm going to send them back to base, because things like court-martials and summary trials didn't work for them. They didn't understand it. You know, they didn't understand the punishment. They didn't understand that they'd done wrong, as a matter of fact, because they were in a vicinity where they had family. So if they're here, why can't they go and visit, you know? So eventually they said to me they'd made contact with 2 relatives that were on the other side, that were with the MPLA. And I immediately cottoned onto this, and I said to them, listen, we'll arrange for these guys to come over the river. I'd like to meet them. I want to talk to them. I want to find out what's potting, what's happening. And eventually it didn't get that far. They got cold feet and didn't want to come through because they were scared from what they were being told and everything by the MPLA. If the South Africans get hold of you. Apparently, one of the big things that we used to do, the story that was doing the rounds in Zambia amongst the civilian population, is we used to boil them in pots. So I don't know where that bunch of hogwash came from, but nothing like that ever happened. So it didn't work. But what did happen is that they did make contact again a couple of times, and we got quite some good intel out of these guys that were on the other side. Yeah, that was another story. And oh yeah, the intel that we got, there used to be this annual infiltration by the Planned Special Forces, by Typhoon, their Typhoon unit, into the farming area, into what was known as the Triangle of Death, the Grootfontein, Ochu, Chumeb area. And we got a lot of info that on the 1730 northern line between Novemberland and Kavango, there was a cut line there. And they'd use that cut line for navigation, and it would go straight down into the emergency grazing area. What was that place called? Just near Tsinsabus. And Tsinsabus is just northwest of Grootfontein. They'd navigate down there, and then obviously they were in the Grootfontein area. And if they turned west, they'd end up at Chumeb, and if they went a little bit southeast, they'd end up in Grootfontein, or go straight down, they'd end up in Ochu. So we managed to get quite a bit of info about the route that they were using. And I passed that on. I don't know if the guys ever used it. I think they did, as a matter of fact, to try and preempt the infiltrations. So yeah, but as I said, a very, very interesting, very good career. Most enjoyable great guys, great soldiers, the Bushmen. What else can I tell you? I don't remember. Yeah, of course, yeah, I think that's about me and my story.
Do you want to call it for the evening?
Yeah, I don't know. If there's something else that you guys can think of, that's something that tallies with something else and you'd like to ask me, you're welcome, you guys. You've got my email address, or you can WhatsApp me.
Yes, I've got your contact details, so I'm going to basically just say thank you very much, and then I'll say, and I'm sure we're going to have you back. And I'm just specifically going to ask viewers to submit us questions in the comment section below, so that we've got a starting point maybe for next time. I've got a few things here that we can discuss offline, that as I say, that I mean, your career in vendor went on for XYZ. We don't know about that. You're farming, you can tell us about, but also I know people will want to ask you. I mean, I'm dumbfounded by what you've told me now. The other guys, I've listened to them, and they all have this, they're all in awe of this sixth sense that the Bushmen have. They've all touched on it. You've delved a little.
No, I think having worked with them and just point to try and get into their psyche. And I think the main reason for me doing that was to do successful operations, because when I walked into the unit, a couple of guys were a bit negative. They said, "No, ons kan nie met hierdie mense werk nie, you know, and what." But eventually I said, "Yeah, they must." I mean, Colonel Linford and the boys did sterling work with them. They did great work. So I said to him, and then eventually I decided, just find out what makes these guys tick. And obviously, because I do have a bit of a gift of the gab, I managed to learn the language. And yeah, and from there it just took off. It just went. It just happened.
Did you find, because of your gift of the gab and learning the language, that you became a focal point for them then too? Did they come with issues that they felt the rest of management couldn't handle?
So. Very much so. I had to mediate in a lot of disputes and family disputes and disputes between clans that came from many years back that they wanted to settle, and you know, all this type of thing. And one had to learn to mediate. Now, fortunately, I'd done a military law course, so you understand the I don't know what the term is, the Latin term, but everybody a chance to say their say. So you give the one crowd the chance, and then you tell them, okay, now you keep quiet, and you give the other, you know, and then you'd sit up, and I'd tell them, I'm not going to give you an answer right now. And I'd go and sit, and you'd make notes, and you go and weigh all these facts up as objectively as you could. And hopefully I was successful doing it. And then I'd get them together and I'd say, right, you know, bury the hatchet, it's bygones, or do this or do that, or sort this out, or see that happens, this one pay that one, and that type of thing. That happened many times, yeah. Now they came to me, especially because they knew I could understand, and because I was in their psyche, the family issues to somebody else would be rubbish. But I knew to them it was an issue, and it was an issue that had to be addressed and had to be solved. Yeah.
Well, Ben, I think we can sit here all night long, but I'm aware of the fact that you're a busy man and you don't have time to sit here all night long. So from my side, I'm going to say thank you very much for episode 1. Ja, mense, luister nou. We're surely going to get Ben back here. So I'm suggesting that you put your questions to Ben in the comments below, and I'll pass them on, and then we can decide when we have another chat. From my point of view, I'd like to still delve a little bit into your career at Vendor, and then after that too. And you obviously were drawn to the the wilder areas, let's call them wilder areas, the drier areas, the game areas where you live. You've mentioned all your hunting. So I think there's a story or 10 to be told about those big ones that got away or those big ones that didn't get away. So from my point, from my side, from Legacy Conversation side, I do thank you sincerely. It's great. I sat here in awe. My jaw was hanging open at times. Thankfully, you guys out there couldn't see that. But I'm going to say thank you very much. And as we always say here at Legacy Conversations, until we meet again, God bless.
Thanks very, very much, Fossie, and thanks for having me. And yeah, I hope I could shed some light on what went down and what happened and how we experienced it. And everything I said, obviously, is from my own point of view and how I experienced it. Other people obviously had other experiences. So yeah, and people, as you say, they're welcome. If there are any questions and I can help, I'll do my bestest to answer, to see if I've got a reply for them. And yeah, we can at a future date delve into what happened after 3-1 Battalion. As early back as last Sunday, I'll send you a picture of somebody caught in the act. So yeah, then you can draw your own deductions there. But anyhow, thanks very, very much. And it was great speaking to you guys.